I started when I was 11 years old with a Wallen sock and a microphone, and my buddies and I would record each other passing gas into the microphone. Found that to be fabulous. Then we would change speeds on the tape machine, which made it really hilarious. You could speed it up, slow down. It was just great.
Hate to be the singer on that mic on the next session, right?
Yeah.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lynda Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. Vance Powell, Glenn Rosenstein, Michael Wagner, Ray Kennedy, Buddy Miller, John McBride, and Alan Parsons. What do all these rock stars have in common other than that they should be on this podcast? They all have something great to say about MikTek microphones. Check out MikTek Audio at miktekaudio.com/artists. Hey rock stars, it's your host Lynda Shaw, and welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Kyle Lehning, a self-admittedly lucky guy who started recording at the age of 17 and is now closing in on 40 plus years as a professional in the art and business of making music. Working with artists as diverse as Little Richard and Chuck Berry to Waylon, Jennings, and George Jones, he also had the extraordinary opportunity from 1992 to 1998 to head up Asylum Records under the chairmanship of Bob Krasow. Kyle continues to produce, engineer, and mix for a wide variety of artists, including Ray Price, Willie Nelson, Randy Travis, Lynda Carter, Jimmy Webb, Johnny Mathis, and Ronnie Milsap, to name just a few. He is also a musician and continues to play jazz with the Leonard Small Situation, often sitting in on keyboards with Electric Mullet and the Sand Shaker in Pensacola. And more importantly, Kyle is the father of Jason Lehning, a previous guest and a friend of mine on the show. So how cool is that? Please welcome Kyle Lehning to Recording Studio Rockstars. Kyle, are you ready to rock?
I am.
Let it roll. You are, man. And let it roll.
Yeah.
So I've done my introduction of you. Tell us a little more about who you are. How did you end up here in Nashville and get started in recording?
Oh, wow. When I said I'm a lucky guy, it's just, some people say you make your own luck. I think luck happens. And if you're smart, you figure out some way to take advantage of the luck when it does happen. So I'm starting all the way back. I had wonderful parents who were just really supportive. My father and my mom were just great. I was a relatively indulged only child.
I met your dad.
Oh, did you?
Yeah, I met your dad right here in front of the studio when Jason was recording. You guys both came by one day.
Oh, okay.
And I remember we got a photo of the three of you.
Oh, great.
Three generations of the Lennings standing right in front of the studio door.
Great. If you have a copy of that, I'd love to see it.
I'll have to look for that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, I'm sorry I don't remember doing that, but that sounds exactly right, because he was always around and we were having a lot of fun. And
was he a musician too?
He did. He played cornet, and when I was 10 years old, he gave me his cornet and said, "You're going to join the band."
Nice.
And so I started playing cornet and trumpet when I was 10. I grew up in a small town, Cairo, Illinois. It's spelled like Cairo, Egypt, but it's pronounced Cairo. And one of the joys of growing up in a small town is you can't hide.
Right.
And so next door neighbor across the street, the Borland family, their daughter Sherry was taking piano lessons, and I was already playing trumpet, so I could read treble clef, and I would go over to their house and just play piano and just make up the left hand, but could figure out where the notes were. And Carolyn Borland convinced my mother that I needed to take piano lessons, and so I was drugged down, literally 4 doors down, to Laura Holliday's house, kicking and screaming, to take piano lessons from Mrs. Halliday, who was the organist at the Presbyterian church that we went to.
Wow.
And thankfully, she, about a year into it, she could figure out that I was bored to death and said, "Well, what do you want to learn?" And somehow I had, by that time, had figured out something about fake books.
Oh yeah, right.
And playing jazz. And I said, "Well, I just want to learn harmony and theory and figure out how to play. And she said, okay, that's what we're going to do. And so all those Schumann books went away, and I ended up with fake books and books about theory and harmony and stuff. And
so now what decade was this?
Would have been, I was 12, so that would have been 1961.
Okay, all right, wow.
Yeah. And then by 1962, I was in a rock and roll band.
Nice.
And here's another thing, small town. I had a distant cousin, Ralph Thomas, and he and I started in the band together on the same day. We were both 10 years old, went to the same grade school. He started playing saxophone. I started playing trumpet. My mom and dad were out of town, and his dad, Pete Thomas, bought me a Wurlitzer electric piano when I was 13 years old.
Well, so 61, the 50s have come and gone, and that was an era of cool jazz, but also the birth of rock and roll. So were you was there like a conflict in choice there as you get into music, or it was all just interwoven? It
was all interwoven, and I was not one of those child prodigy jazz kids. But I did learn how to play some Bill Black's combo tunes, and and I had the band that I got to play with were all older guys, so we were doing Ray Charles and a lot of instrumentals, which were great in the early 60s. And, there was always an instrumental hit on the radio.
Right, yeah.
I loved that about that time.
Like Green Onions and all that, right?
Green Onions and White Silver Sands and just the Ventures. So it was really a lot of fun.
All right, so you're growing up in Illinois and playing music. What were you listening to at the time? Still rock and roll and cool jazz? And how long did it take before you were moving from Cairo? I don't imagine you stayed there much beyond
high school. High school? When I went to college. Well, yeah, another member of the family was my great uncle, my dad's uncle, and he was a doctor. And besides being a doctor, he was a really good baritone saxophone player, like a Jerry Mulligan kind of player. And he had this outrageous stereo system. He had JBL Hartsfields, Macintosh power amps and preamps, great turntable. He had a Crown 2-track.
That always makes such a big difference, doesn't it? Like you kind of have to be exposed to somebody with a killer stereo system to first get interested in this stuff, don't you?
Yeah. And somewhere around 1960 or 61, I heard Back at the Chicken Shack by Jimmy Smith, Stanley Turrentine, Donald Bailey, and Kenny Burrell, and I've never recovered. So that was like that's how I fell in love with the B3. And so that's been my hobby passion ever since is trying to figure out how to be a little bit better B3 player.
Cool. We'll try and find a link to that Back in the Chicken Shack and put it in the show notes too.
Yeah. Okay.
See if we can find a YouTube link for it or something.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So then did you go straight to Nashville after that, or what was the story there?
The high school rock and roll band continued on, and in the summer of '67, we had decided to go make a record. And there was a little recording studio in Paducah, Kentucky. And the studio, actually, in retrospect, I do have some pictures, but I wish I had great pictures of it. In retrospect, it was actually really well equipped. He had Ampex tape machines, Ampex mixers, AKG C12s. When I look at it now, it's like, well, that's a 67. Those are C12s.
Yeah, wow.
Those were awesome microphones. And so we went in there to make our own little recording. And that was it. I was done. It was like, okay, I love the smell of it. He could cut his own acetates, the tape, the acetates, the machines, the knobs, the meters, the whole thing. I just was like, okay, I got to find a way to do this.
Yeah.
Somehow, some way, I got to do this.
And what town was that?
It was in Paducah, Kentucky.
Paducah, right. Okay, cool. So not too far from Nashville, but about halfway between here and St. Louis.
Yeah, exactly.
That's where I always stop for coffee when I'm driving to St. Louis.
Yeah. So it was a lot of, so we went in the studio and then we were trying to figure out now what. We've got these 3 songs that we've recorded, and my dad, once again, said, well, Ray Butts lives in Nashville, and he grew up in Cairo, and he's from Cairo, and he's down there. Maybe you ought to take your tapes down there. Now, Ray Butts, some people will know who that is, some people won't. He's an inventor, and he invented a guitar amplifier called the Echosonic guitar amp. And it was an amp in the mid-'50s that Scotty Moore used when he played live with Elvis, because in the mid-'50s, that amplifier had a tape delay built into it, like an Echoplex. It was built into the amplifier.
So that's where that sound is coming from.
Yeah. and all that slappy electric guitar stuff. So Scotty turned Chet Atkins onto the amp. Chet goes to Cairo, meets Ray, who's got a hi-fi store and an electronics shop, sees what's going on, because not only is he building amplifiers, he's winding guitar pickups. And so he convinces Ray to move to Nashville, and he hires him to work at RCA as an engineer.
Okay, all right, cool.
So I go down to Nashville, and Ray's daughter, Katha, used to play piano for me at band contests when I was a kid. And so Ray got me and my buddy Don Dickerson, who's was the saxophone player, and he and I, unfortunately, I did some singing, which was horrible. I'm going to tell you how you can actually find this record on YouTube.
Okay.
And all your listeners can have a big laugh. But Ray got us meetings with 2 record company execs in Nashville. Had I known who these people really were, I doubt that I would have been able to actually attend the meeting. But I was young and dumb and didn't know. And so we met with Billy Sherrill, who was running Epic Records, genius record producer, and really cool guy. And he listened. They sat and listened to all 3 of these songs, top to bottom, didn't stop in the middle or anything, and just said, well, I just don't think this is for us, but it's kind of cool. But thanks for coming by.
I've heard that kind of response before in our A&R office.
Yeah. Then the next guy we met was Felton Jarvis, who was Elvis Presley's producer and A&R man at RCA. And Felton then said, there's this group called Jefferson Airplane that's hot right now. This was the summer of '67.
Yeah, I was busy being born.
Don't rub it in. Anyway, so the summer of '67, he said, Jefferson Airplane's hot. You guys ought to look for a female singer, which was a very kind way of saying neither one of us could sing well at all. So here we go. So Katha, Ray's daughter, said, well, I know some girls that can sing. And so she set up a couple of meetings. And one of the girls that showed up to sing her name was Vicky Farmer. And she and I got married 3 years later.
Wow.
Yeah. And that's Jason's mom.
Right on.
Yeah.
Congratulations. What a great story.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great. And so to continue the story a little bit, Vicky happened to live in Goodlettsville next door to Tom Paul Glaser, who was part of Tom Paul and the Glaser Brothers, who were a wonderful country act, great singers.
Any relation to Joe Glaser, who has the guitar shop in Nashville?
I don't know if there's a direct relation or not.
Or was the Dickerson you mentioned before any relation to Dickerson Road, right one away from here?
I don't think so.
Nashville's not that small of a town.
No, but Don Dickerson, was from Cairo too. But anyway, so Vicky was like working as a receptionist at the Glaser Brothers studio, but she also is a singer. And so she and I were always messing around with songs and stuff. By that time, I had a couple of Tandberg tape recorders and some Bogan mic mixers and microphones. And I was trying to figure out, had my own little home studio set up. Then I had a TAC 4-track, so I was into trying to figure out how to do that. So I was in college, and we got married in 1970, which was the year before I graduated from college. And I was hanging around the Glaser studio all the time when we would come to Nashville. And she was there and I was there. Claude Hill was the guy who built and designed and built that studio. And it had a Flickinger console.
Oh, I love the Flickinger console. I've worked on one.
This is now in the 21st century, and I will tell you it's still the best sounding console I've ever worked on.
Wayne Moss has a Flickinger console up at Cinderella Sound.
Yeah. I'm well aware of that. I've pulled out stuff I did on that console just a couple of years ago and put the tapes on, and I went, whoa, this is actually kind of depressing. It sounds that good.
Yeah.
I mean, first of all, I was so young. This was done as this was a project I did in 1974, and I pulled it out and listened to it, and I thought, man, I don't know. Things are, I'm not sure, digital gets better and better all the time. But man, it sure sounded good.
Well, nobody's just made the Flickinger plugin yet.
Well, that's probably right.
Shout out to you, plugin makers.
There you go.
Let's see it.
Yep. Class A. It was awesome sounding console. It was the first one I really got to work on. So what did I know until I had to go start working on other consoles?
Well, we had a chance to record on Bill Skibby's Flickinger console up at Key Club Recording, which is in Benton Harbor, Michigan. And he has Sly Stone's console.
Yep.
And we did sessions when I was working with this band, The Living Things. And the stuff we did, which I don't even remember if it really got used finally and released, but it just sounded so rock and roll, you know? And one of the records that Wayne did up at Cinderella Sound that I really liked when I was sort of checking out the records that were done there, Silk Purse
I don't know.
for Lynda Ronstadt.
Oh, okay.
Was done up there.
Okay.
And you can hear that kind of, Flickinger has a distortion that you really love on the drums, you know, just a little bit of crunchiness, which is great.
Well, the on the console that we had, I don't know that I ever got it distorting. It just sounded so wide open. It was very open sounding, and just everything just felt real natural in it, and I just loved it. It was a great sounding board.
Well, I feel like that's a tone that I've heard listening to some of your records too, is there's a quality of openness and warmth and naturalness, like everything's kind of up close, intimacy, you know, I guess in the sound. Were you interested in country music? I mean, you talked about getting into rock and roll. Jefferson Airplane is the first reference when you land in Nashville. Yet you became, you had to gain notoriety in producing country music as well. So how did you transition? I mean, was that just the given place direction to go in Nashville, or was that also a real passion of yours? Well,
it's a couple of things. When I was in high school, I was a closet country fan. I wouldn't really admit it.
I'm a closet EDM DJ.
There you go. So I would be at home alone watching the Porter Wagner show and not really telling anybody about it. But I was fascinated with the steel and with the musicianship and just kind of the general feeling of that music and what was going on. You know, there were some Buck Owens records that Buck had almost a rockabilly kind of quality to him in some regards, but it was real country, but he had an edgy kind of quality. So I related to that, but it wasn't something that I was fixated on. I just thought this is really interesting, and I like it. I became the chief engineer at Tom Paul Glazer's studio from 1972 until early 76. So at that point, I was really sort of being steeped in country music and got to work with lots of different country artists over those 4 years. And so I got to work with Tom Paul, and that was eye-opening and interesting. And I got to work with a lot of great musicians, all of whom were playing country records, but all of whom were incredibly deep players and just had, I got to understand what restraint was all about.
Right. And
just watching these guys shape a record and how quickly they could do it and how beautifully it would come together. So I had, my respect for that genre and for the musicianship happened very quickly. It wasn't slow. It was like, oh, I see. Especially since I thought when I first came to town, I might be a session piano player. And I gave that silly notion up as soon as I heard Pig Robbins playing on a record. And it was like, well, that
I can't do that.
I got to find another way.
Well, so, I think when you get interested in jazz, you grow an appreciation for musicianship and people really listening to each other and playing. And an appreciation for rock and roll probably has a lot to do with really loving the attitude behind it and the power of a powerful rhythm section. And when you move to Nashville and you hear the musicians here playing together on a session, it's easy to appreciate that fine musicianship and people who can really show restraint and play together quickly and create an amazing record so quickly.
Absolutely.
So, I had a similar experience in terms of just being introduced to great musicians, and seeing what that's all about and watching somebody play, the fewest notes, but just the right ones.
Yep.
Well, so I like to ask at the beginning of our interview here for an inspirational quote. I don't know, do you have anything you'd like to share with us?
Oh, good gosh. I don't know. It may pop up sometime. I'll tell you something that was said to me. I don't know how inspirational it is, but it sure was helpful. I was fortunate enough to be asked to work on the last record that Ray Price made. And I engineered and mixed that record. Fred Foster produced it. and Bergen White arranged it. And it was a phenomenal experience because, there were 14 strings and a rhythm section and Ray and everything. And so it was all live on the floor.
That's great.
It was awesome. And as, Bergen counted the arrangement off and the record came out of the speakers. It wasn't like, here's a basic track that we're now going to have to figure out what to do with. It was like, there's the record. And it was just incredible. But when we got done...
Was that done at RCA Studio A?
No, it was done at Ocean Way.
Ocean Way, okay.
Yeah, the big room at Ocean Way. Didn't hear any trucks on the strings,
right.
But could have. Anyway, when we were getting ready to mix the record, Ray, he had initially paid for the project out of his own pocket. So I was getting ready to start mixing the record. And I said, Ray, is there anything special? I know you want the strings up and the vocal's going to be great. I said, is there anything special you want me to do on the record? And he said, I just want to hear everything I paid for.
That's great.
And I just thought, man, that just cuts right to it, doesn't it?
That is a pretty inspiring quote, because it reminds us as engineers, that we are primarily assisting somebody to see a project through, a record through. And it's really important for us to be reminded all the time, whether it's money out of somebody's pocket or it's time out of somebody's schedule, there's a lot of investment that people put into making records with us. And we have, we need to keep a good life-work balance going through that process. But we really are responsible for delivering what a lot of people have invested in, usually when we're making a record.
Yep. Yeah, it's for me, it's always been a position of privilege to be part of that process. So, I love it. I've loved it since I was a kid.
That's great. Well, now, how about sharing a story about an important failure?
Oh, gosh. There have been so many.
I can't believe it.
Yeah.
You've never failed.
Yeah. So many failures. I've always learned way more from the failures than from the successes. I mean, the first one that I learned from was very early on in my career. And this is probably weird, but this is what comes to mind. I was working in the studio at the Glazer Brothers studio, and we were working on a record. And, this was the early 70s, 73. So there was a lot of drugs around and a lot of just craziness. And I never did drugs. It just wasn't. My dad was a second generation pharmacist and somehow convinced me that they were, drugs were to make you well if you were sick, not to entertain you.
Right.
So I somehow took that to heart and just didn't get into that. But I did, I'd have a cocktail from time to time. And so there was some booze around. And so I somehow ended up mixing one night and getting kind of blasted while I was mixing. And I'm sitting there thinking to myself, I am God. This is maybe the best thing ever. And now I know the secret to this stuff. And this is why all the guys that I look up to are alcoholics, and it's worth it. If that's if this is the price,
all what's going on in your head at that time.
If this is the price you got to pay and this is what it takes, I'm in. Luckily for me, I came in the next day and listened back to the mix, which was absolutely unlistenable. I mean, it was like I could not believe that what I thought was happening that night was what I was actually hearing the next morning. I really, it was just unbelievable. It was horrible. It was just swimming in reverb and just impossible to listen to. And I thought, this is a gift, and I'm glad I failed as a drunken mixer. We might not be having this conversation today. So, that's a different kind of failure. But a
lucky one, really, that you had that kind of clarity to see.
I told you I was lucky.
Yeah.
Other failures, gosh.
How about any career stuff where a long career is bound to have some real transitional moments along the way?
Yeah, the first record I produced by myself was England Dan and John Ford Coley's I'd Really Love to See You Tonight. And I had, up to that point, had been slogging away in the studio literally every second I could. It was 18-hour days. It might be 7 days a week. when I was not working with clients, I was bringing my friends in to record their songs and just trying.
And married at this point.
And married.
And raising a family with kids too?
Yep. Jason was born in, 72. He was born in 1972 when I started working at the studio. So, yeah, I mean, it was a lot of life going on. So the first record I produced sells 1 million copies.
Nicely done.
Yeah. And the second single that came out of that album was a top 5 record, and I thought, this is easy. And then I went to work. Doug Morris was owned Big Tree and was at Atlantic Records, and he convinced me to become a staff producer at Atlantic in the late 70s, 77. And I said, okay. And so I took that job and proceeded to just not have any hits. I went into this sort of just tailspin of no success. And we parted company probably in early 1980 or so, somewhere around there. Not long after I did the Chuck Berry record with Doug. There's a record called Rocket that we did. Oh,
cool, yeah.
Yeah, and that's a story, and that's a whole interview we could do sometime.
All right.
So anyway, Doug let me go, and I'd never really been fired before. And it was really painful. It was difficult. And not only did he let me go, but I wasn't having any hits. And so I went through this period from probably 1980. There were a number of years where being a record producer, which is what I wanted to be, I just wasn't hot. There wasn't anything happening. And so thankfully I could still engineer and mix, and I still loved doing that. And people would ask me to come and work on their records. And so I managed to sort of stay relevant in the business by being an engineer and by being a mixer and working on other people's records. And then there were a few, Dan Seals, who was England Dan, decided to take a shot at a country career, and we started doing that. And so we started making some records and then started to have some success. And then I ended up producing Keith Stegall, whom, have you interviewed Keith?
No, not yet, no.
You should.
All right.
He's awesome. He's an amazing producer and a great music maker. And Keith was trying to be an artist on Epic. He had written We're in This Love Together for Al Jarreau, and it's some pop hits and country hits. And so he was signed to Epic as an artist, and he and I went in the studio to make a record, which is actually a pretty good record. But in the midst of making that record, I'd also started working with Ronnie Milsap at that point, engineering his records, recording his tracks, and then mixing his albums. I think the first thing we did was Stranger in My House, which was a big record for Ronnie. Anyway, while I'm working on Keith's record, he brings me this cassette tape and says, I'm making this live recording on a guy who's the catfish cook at the Nashville Palace. And he said, I want you to listen to it and tell me what you think. And I put the tape on, and I listened to about 20 seconds, and I turned it off, and I said, who's this guy? And he says, well, his name is Randy Ray. And that was Randy Travis.
Wow.
Yeah. And so I called Martha Sharp at Warner Brothers because I'd heard that she was interested. Charlie Monk, who was managing Keith at the time, was hanging around and said, I think Martha might be interested. And I called her and just said, hey, I just heard this young guy. I hear you might be interested. I'd be more than willing to put my hat in the ring. And Martha ended up signing him to a singles deal. And Keith and I co-produced the first 4 sides that were recorded on Randy.
Wow.
One of them was On the Other Hand, which was Randy's first #1 record.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
What a cool story. What kind of takeaway do you have through that whole chapter? You started by producing a 1 million selling record, and then somebody came along and offered an opportunity, and you took it. And you felt like, you went through a dip there and came out on the other end of that, probably far more experienced, having produced a number of records at that point too. And you discover a new artist. It almost sounds to me like the successes were moments where you were on your own terms, sort of following your own guiding light for what you wanted to do next. Is there any correlation to that, do you think? Do you have any hindsight about that sort of thing?
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, one of the really cool things about failure and just about life in general is that if it were up to me to have control over every single thing that was going to happen, so few things would actually happen. So, I mean, because Doug Morris had asked me to come be a staff producer at Atlantic, I got to meet Arif Mardin, and I got to meet Tom Dowd, and I got to meet Ahmet Ertegun.
Wow. And
Ahmet Ertegun, who was the founder of Atlantic Records, was such an interesting, fascinating man with so much history. And one of the things I remember hearing him say one time was, the secret to the music business is to just keep walking, because eventually you'll step in some shit. And
there's our inspirational quote right there.
There it is. And, for me, it was that, first of all, there was no plan B. Somehow I was going to be around the process of making records. That's what I had real, genuine enthusiasm for, was doing that. And so I was going to find a way to keep doing that. And just because I was sort of in the hunt all the time and always around and always trying to do my very best work, which I'll tell you something about very best work in a minute. But, I think just to persevere and to just keep walking, opportunities do show, they come. Opportunities come. Paul Lime is a dear friend of mine and a wonderful drummer whom I've worked with since '83. And we worked together just a couple weeks ago. I mean, we still, he's a fabulous drummer. His name is Leim, if your listeners want to look him up. He's a ridiculous player.
Okay.
But Paul always had something he would say, which is, opportunities come and, doors open, but you have to walk through them.
Right.
And not everybody does for one reason or another. There's an opportunity that'll come, and there have been some, that doesn't mean I've said yes to every single thing, but I've said yes a whole lot more often than I've said no.
Yeah.
And, I just think it's important to just keep your antenna tuned and try
walking through the door is a tough thing to do sometimes.
Yeah.
I feel like I like what you're saying about antennas tuned. I feel like it's sort of clarity of mind to be clear enough that you can recognize opportunities when they're arriving. Mm-hmm. And then, making smart choices about which ones to do. Because it's true, you can't take every opportunity. You got to say no to stuff so that you can say yes to the right thing.
That's right.
Well, so now how about was there an aha moment for you along the way? Was there a point at which things clicked? I feel like you shared one already about making those records. But, Randy came along and you guys started making records. And is this sort of a point at which your career started taking off again?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was lucky enough to be there to make a record with Randy Travis, thanks to, Keith Stegall, who brought me this. And Keith produced the first 4 records. And then actually the very first single we put out on Randy was On the Other Hand. And it died in the 60s, the first time they put it out.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Keith was trying to write songs. He was trying to be an artist. He was trying, and he was trying to produce this, and he was going through a difficult time personally. And he just said, man, I don't think I can do all this. So, and Randy's first single had not happened. And he just said, so I think I've got to let something go. And he said, I think I'm just going to stop this producing thing and you carry on. And fortunately for me, I didn't have any other options. So I said, okay, I'll keep working on this. And so we continued to record, and then we recorded a song called 1982 on Randy, and that became a top 10 record. And then they re-released On the Other Hand the second time, and it went to number 1. And those 2 songs, 1982 and On the Other Hand, blew him up. And he went from being sort of an odd stone country singer to being the hottest thing in the music business. Yeah. And, I remember when we finished Randy's album, he and I sat in the studio together, and I had done the math on how many songs we'd recorded, how much it cost us to make the record, and how many records we needed to sell just so we could maybe, the record company might let us make another record, which was all I was really hoping. It was like, I love this guy. I hope we get to make another record. And I figured if we sold 40,000 copies, that would generate enough money to maybe let them think, well, I know it's not very much, but we sold 4 million.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So not like I knew that was coming.
Right. Well, but just like most of us, if we're thinking about this stuff with any longevity, we're sort of all along the way doing some of the math and going, okay, as long as we can break even and we can be here next month and 6 months from now, we'll just be able to keep going, and that's a mindset we all get into. So I don't know if you can really adopt that 4 million sales mindset, but if you're doing your best work, perhaps it comes along like that,
I don't know what causes that to happen. The only thing I know, I read a book by David Mamet years ago called Some Freaks, which was a collection of his essays. And he said something in there that really, encapsulated what I had experienced, which was, and this is dealing with the arts particularly, but we have no control over whether our work is going to be successful or not. There's just no control over that. And believe me, I know that to be true. And I can tell you about that having run a record company. I'll tell you something about that in a minute. But you have no control over whether your work is going to be successful or not. You have total control over whether the work that's being done is what we intend it to be. And that's what I always did. I always focused on what is it we're trying to do here. Let's make sure that's what gets done. And the rest of it's going to have to it'll be what it's going to be. It's up to the gods. It's up to whatever.
Yeah. All right. Well, that begs an important question. When is it time to give up on something?
Well, my two favorite words are genuine enthusiasm. I find that to be the most reliable barometer for anything that I'm involved in life. Doesn't matter what it is. It could be the first 15 minutes of a movie that I just sat in. And if I'm not hooked, I will walk out.
Right.
It's just like there's life short. I got other things to do. So for me, genuine enthusiasm is the key. So if I can muster enough self-awareness to know when I'm feeling genuinely enthusiastic about an artist, about a project, about the work I'm doing, that will tell me when it's time to let go. And if I've lost that enthusiasm, it's not fair to me or the artist to try to continue that relationship.
Now, I feel like sometimes we lose the enthusiasm along the way and we just need a break and it comes back. So what have you learned about checking yourself to make sure you've truly lost the enthusiasm?
Yeah, well, that falls under the category of self-awareness. I think there are forces for good and I think there are forces for evil in the world. So I think sometimes things can come in and cloud my judgment. And one of the things that I like to do is just take a deep breath and try not to make real rash decisions.
Yeah.
Give myself some time. If the feeling persists over a number of days, number of weeks, then it's like, okay, I need, now I have some clarity about how to proceed and try not to make, really a real rash decision. On the contrary, in the studio, I think quick decisions are the healthy way to go. When it comes to creative in the studio decisions, it either rubs me right or it rubs me wrong. And if it rubs me right, let's go that direction. If it rubs me wrong, let's stop that. Let's do something else.
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison between the two, and that's so true.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so let's jump into some more specific, some geekier questions.
Okay.
What makes a great producer?
Well, I think the thing that makes a great producer is the capacity to listen. It's just about listening. It's listen without ego. And once again, it's having the awareness and the courage to act upon that gut reaction to something. I try not to let my intellect talk me out of what my body's already told me.
Right.
But it sure tries. It sure tries to do that.
There's a lot of reasons not to do cool ideas in the studio, right?
All kinds of reasons. Well, maybe we can do, we talk about digital recording and things like that. I'll give you a quick example. It was a Randy Travis album we were working on, and I had a studio full of Nashville's absolute finest. We had drums, bass, 2 keyboard players, 2 acoustic players, electric, steel, and fiddle, all live on the floor at one time. Absolute best players in town, genius players, great song, great singer. And when I'm producing, I used to engineer and produce at the same time, but I stopped that fairly early on once I had to start moving around from studio to studio because I just was I wasn't able to listen. I was having to think too much.
Yeah.
So I would hire not only a genius musician, but I'd hire a genius engineer too.
Yeah.
And have somebody that I just knew I didn't have to think about. Consequently, I don't even stay in the control room when I'm producing. I sit on the floor with a set of headphones, and I'm in the same space that the players are in.
Cool.
Yeah, for two reasons. One of them is I like to feel what the players are feeling and just have that connection. And the other one is that if I'm in the control room, that part of my brain will start activating, and I'll start looking at EQ instead of just listening to performance.
Yeah.
So I like to be out of there.
What are some tools that you like to have with you if you're out on the floor producing like that? Do they set up a talkback mic for you and a pair of headphones? And any other stuff that we wouldn't think about?
No, it's just a talkback mic, and I did at one time think about bringing my own effects rack so I could have my own reverb for my talkback.
How about a rubber band gun so you can shoot musicians to get their attention?
Yeah, some of those things would be good, but anyway, so I'm sitting out there in the room with these guys, and we're recording to Pro Tools, and we count the song off, and we don't get 4 bars into the intro, and I hear not a big mistake, but a sort of time mistake, which I know we can just move in Pro Tools, and we haven't gotten to the first verse yet, and I'm already thinking about an edit that we can make to fix that. And we got about 4 bars into the first verse, and I stopped the band and confessed what had happened. I said, I got to tell you, I'm sitting here. There was one little weird thing in the intro, and I'm already not listening because I'm thinking, well, I can fix that, so we can just go on without. And I said, that's absurd, because you guys are the best musicians on the planet, and you can play the intro without making that tiny mistake.
Right.
So how about we do this again?
Back in 1975, we would have never let that fly.
We'd have not. You'd have had to. I would have stopped it. But the technology puts all these other options into play, and
they're kind of ego options too. Really, I mean, as engineers, it strokes our ego to know that we're good at doing magician tricks.
Absolutely. And in some cases, thank God we can do that. But not on the intro, and not with this caliber of musicians sitting in the room. And it's like, we stopped, we redid it, and the take was genius.
Yeah.
The next take, they played it. And I think my confession sort of tuned them up just a little bit. There's just maybe, I'll bet you they knew exactly what I was talking about.
Right, and they just kept going because you didn't say anything.
Yeah, that's right.
And they were thinking like, boy, I don't know. He's really like sliding here a little bit, He used to stop us on that kind of thing.
Yeah, it was funny. So I mean, it's a love-hate relationship with that technology. That's for sure.
Well, it's cool to hear you talk about hiring the very best too, because I think that is a wise thing to do when you can do it. And I wonder if you have seen examples where people have simply hired the very best people and seen success with the project that they've done, or it's really been well received as a result of that. Do you have any advice around, hiring the very best, or when, not having the very, very best is just fine too? Or is it sometimes good to mix it up and you get like a real dynamic going?
Yeah, I've been spoiled in that regard because I've spent the majority of my career working with the best studio players in town. I've only made a few records in the course of my career with bands. And I don't know that I'm a great producer of bands, mainly because my patience level is not quite what it might need to be in order to really be good with that. Although I've done a couple records with bands that I'm really proud of, that they turned out well, and it was a fun experience. But, it's also, producing is about casting, and you become your own casting director, and just knowing who the players are and what the flavors are that are being looked for the artist is really important. And the other thing that I think we talk about failures, the other thing too is to admit that a casting mistake has been made.
Right.
It's not the player's
That's
fault.
a tough one. Tell us about that. I mean, I've been there before, and it's a tricky thing to admit to, or to, to deal with.
It's expensive to make those mistakes because that's on me. That's not on the guy who showed up for the session. And I mean, I was working on a record with Dan Seals in California in the late 70s. And we had gone in the studio with a bunch of very high caliber studio guys, all of whom have played on hit records. And it was a disaster. It was just, I had sort of cherry picked players for certain reasons, and these guys don't play together.
Right.
And I'm not a particularly seasoned LA producer, but it was something that, I just got sideways on. And we spent 2 3-hour sessions in the studio. And by midway through the second 3-hour session, I just stopped it and just said, this is not working. It's not fun. It's not working. I don't have any adjectives in my producer's back pocket to figure out what to say or do to make this work. So, signed the time cards, and it's been nice, knowing you guys. And there were, I'm not going to name names because but there were some great musicians in that group. It just was the wrong combination. And I went to Danny, the artist, and I said, man, I am so sorry. And he said, but clearly it's not working. When it's not working. Well, I've seen another example of that. I've seen projects where money was spent on the studio. I spent a great deal of time before on a project where we were in the studio for 3 weeks. We got all this stuff, and we had to use it because we had gone and recorded it. But again, same thing. It was all crap. It wasn't that great. And we just wasted, months fussing with the stuff. And we had Pro Tools, and we could manipulate everything. We thought we would manipulate our way out of a deep hole. Yeah. That's, talk about, devilish seduction. Yeah. It really is. I've had it happen. I mean, I did a record. And Danny and I have had that happen a couple times. We started a record in LA, cut the whole thing with some really nice guys who were all single scale players, and we hated it, and called the record label and said, this is bad. And they said, well, start over again. And we did, and we used, Jeff Porcaro and Lee Sklar and a bunch of double scale wonderful players, and the record was really good. That's amazing. Same songs. That's so great. Yeah. Well, Rockstars, that is a good takeaway for you is, when you have the chance to work with great musicians, just do it. So I refer to our listeners as the Rockstars, if you hear me say that. Yeah. Speaking of devilish, we're getting like a vicious downpour outside the studio right now. I can hear it. Is that what it is? Yeah, banging on the door. So it's pretty exciting. All right, so let me ask you, Kyle, a couple more geeky questions. Let's talk about the pedal steel guitar, because that's such a unique Nashville thing, and you've had a lot of experience with that. What advice do you have, or what can you teach us about recording and mixing pedal steel guitar? For example, does compression play a big role in something like that, or does it play no role in it? Well, once again, it's all about the player, isn't it? I find that the guys in Nashville that I use on, I don't think I ever use compression on it, at least not when I'm recording it. I might on the back end if I'm looking for a certain quality, but not in terms of managing the discrepancies in level, because I think the actual pedaling, volume pedaling of the steel guitar has so much to do with the soul of the instrument. So it's tricky, It's one of those instruments that I find really brings its own dynamic to how it blends in the track. Mm-hmm. Although I think you have to be very attentive to setting the headphone mix for that player so that they really know where the ceiling is and where the floor is, when they're playing. Whereas acoustic instruments sometimes they have a lot of dynamic, but can also benefit from some just right compression to sort of make them speak in the mix. And all That's right. That's right. It's the same with the B3. It's very similar because it's such a volume pedal dependent. Yeah, especially instrument. If you got a player who's using the volume pedal. Yeah, yeah. I don't always have that. Sometimes it's just max out. Yeah, very cool. Now, what about effects? Pedal steel, we think of reverb and stuff like that. How often does the musician bring that through the instrument, and how often is that added later in the mix? Most of the time, I'll ask them to give it to me dry, and I'll give them verb in the phones, to their taste, so they can hear it how they want to hear it. But I do like the option. There's some times when it depends on the player too. Russ Paul is a wonderful steel player. Yeah, he's great. He's been here. Yeah, and I would sometimes he'll do an effect that I know he's triggering off of, and that works really well. Paul Franklin, great player. Sometimes, Paul gets into things where he's actually triggering other sounds from the steel, and I'll record those on separate tracks, so I'll have the option of using or not using them later on. And Dan, there's so many awesome steel players. Dan Dugmore.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, just phenomenal.
What's the most number of pedal steel players you've had play on a session at the same time? Have you ever had like a collection of steel on the
Actually,
floor?
I don't think I have, but I've had Caton Roberts. And I don't know if you know who Caton Roberts is. He was Hank Snow's steel player. And having Caton Roberts play on a session is like having 6 steel guitar players playing at one time. He's ridiculous. He's just an amazing player to have, and nobody around here plays like him. Jerry Bird plays like that. I mean, but it's an old style. He doesn't even play pedal steel. It's a lap steel, and he uses the volume knob with his little finger.
Oh yeah, cool.
And he uses the tone control to do this wah-wah thing. And so it's just this crazy acrobatic event. And it's just amazing. So,
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's cool. My roommate actually has moved to Nashville to learn and study pedal steel. So he's pretty excited about this interview that we're doing as well. And he mentioned that there was an acoustic pedal steel that you had recorded on a record at one time. Do you remember that one? And can you tell us what that was all about?
It's on a Randy Travis. It's a Randy Travis song called Forever and Ever Amen. And it was Paul Franklin's father, who builds Franklin steel guitars, built it, and it's called a pedal bro.
That's right, the pedal bro.
Yeah, it's a pedal bro. And I'm pretty sure that the first instance of it being used on a record was Forever and Ever Amen, and it's on the intro of Forever and Ever Amen. And it's very cool, and it's a really neat sound.
So essentially it's a cross between a pedal steel and a dobro.
Correct.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, I had thought that your career path went sort of from musician to engineer to producer, but it sounds like you kind of went from musician to producer to engineer to producer.
No, you're right. It was producer to engineer to, from musician to engineer to producer. That's exactly right.
I know for me, I'm quite aware, not initially, but now I'm quite aware of the difference between trying to wear too many hats in the studio. Mm-hmm. When I have the chance to just produce and I hire an engineer, I'm so happy.
Yeah.
I'm so happy. And at the end of the day, I feel like I've just really done a great job.
Yeah.
And somehow I feel like the music has really been done a real justice.
Yeah.
Whereas when I'm engineering, I'm satisfied as well, but it's, I feel more like I scored a goal or something, like I'm proud of my ability to have done some stuff, which isn't necessarily serving the artist in the song in the same way,
You asked me about aha moments, and what you're talking about reminds me of one early on in my career, because I was spending so much time engineering. I'd gotten to a point where I had started to be really judgmental about the quality of the music. There was like, oh, this is beneath me, or it's not,
When you were engineering?
Yeah. I'm doing a record and it's like, oh, this is not great, and the song's not great, and the singer's not great. And my enthusiasm was starting to wane. But by the same token, there wasn't anything else I wanted to do. So I felt a little trapped until this little voice in my head said, hey, your job is not to judge this music or these performances. Your job is to make this sound as good as you can possibly make it sound. Mm. And as soon as that clarity happened, I really shifted my attitude toward what I had control over, what David Mamet's talking about. You can't control your success. You can't always control what's going on in the studio. I do have complete control over how, whatever that is, how that's going to sound. And it was really interesting because I think that conversation with myself really started to turn what the work I was doing into something that other people started to take notice of. And it started to offer me opportunities that probably wouldn't have come had I not had that attitude shift.
That's great. Yeah. When I was listening to some of your stuff, I went, Randy Travis Volume 2. There's a Volume 1 and Volume 2 recently, or I think it was recently at all. You have such a long discography. If it was near the top, it looked recent.
It's probably best of collections or something.
Maybe it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So these were re-releases of previous stuff.
Probably.
Well, there was a tone on it for sure that I heard where I had heard some newer records you'd done, and then I listened to Randy, and it really, there was like a warm analog, maybe an older quality to it that sounded cool. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about that difference in quality of tones. Do you sometimes record analog now, or do you strictly record digital when you're producing a record? And how has country music and the making of a country record changed from when you started to now? I know that's a lot of questions, but
Yeah.
take a shot at any of them.
Okay. If I can try to remember those, I record digitally. Analog is, I'm not really, I don't have the patience for it because the equipment is hard to keep running properly. Tape is iffy. So there are a lot of aspects of it that don't fit my current patience level. The other thing is I think digital technology is just getting better and better. It's not getting worse. Analog sort of stopped in the late 70s, and there have been maybe a few improvements since then. Not that there was anything wrong with that. It still sounds good if you can find something that's tweaked and reliable. That stuff still sounds great. But the development of wonderful new techniques has just sort of gone away in that world. So, and I forget the other questions that you had.
How has producing a country record changed from when you started to now?
Well, it depends on what you call country. I mean, certainly, the format is geared toward a different kind of listener, I think. And so a lot of what shows up on the ACM and CMA award shows now feels like 80s rock and roll with a steel and a fiddle stuck in there somehow. And that's okay. I mean, it's all right. And then you do have artists like Jason Isbell. And so, it depends on what you call country. And for me, a while back when I ran a record label for 6 years, and it started to dawn on me that what you could define country music based on whatever country radio stations were playing. It sort of didn't matter if it was Merle Haggard or if it was Florida Georgia Line. If a country radio station was playing it, well, that's what we call country music now. So I don't get too nutty about all that stuff, but it's a new day and there's a whole new approach to it. I still have an affinity for more traditional country music because I think it's harder to come up with a great new song in that genre than it is to come up with a rock and snare drum.
Yeah. That's cool. Rockstars, I don't know if you can hear it in the background, but we've got the gods are throwing lightning bolts down on the studio right now. So pretty exciting. The computer screen shut off even for a moment as the battery backup kicked in. We did not lose our recording.
Yeah, I want to know what that battery backup is.
The very best.
Yes.
All right. Well, so let me ask you one more question, then we'll take a break and come in for the jam session.
Okay.
Tell us about creating a hit vocal production. What advice do you have for us about, A, recording vocals and B, producing those vocals?
Well, I'm going to quote another early mentor of mine, Arif Mardin, who's a great record producer. And I didn't really get to spend much time with him. I just met him on a couple of occasions. I'm sure
maybe introduce our listeners to who he is as well.
Well, Arif Mardin, let's see. He produced Aretha Franklin, Chain, 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 Respect, all those great records in the 60s. He produced Hall & Oates, She's Gone. He produced...
and Atlantic was his label, right?
He was one of the staff producers at Atlantic, one of their main guys. Produced the Bee Gees, Jive Talkin', and Nights on Broadway.
Oh, yeah. We might have to talk about that. That was done right here on this console.
Yeah, which we have a mutual story about that, don't we?
Yeah. Do you want to share that story right now?
Well, sure. In 1972, when I was trying to get started and had not started working at the Glazer studio yet, my friend Claude Hill, who used to work at the Glazer studio and had built and designed that, had moved down to Fort Lauderdale to go to work with Jeep Harnett at MCI. And Claude said, and he knew I had been in the studio and I've been using the studio and mixing stuff and trying, and I had a little collection of things that I had done. And Claude said, why don't you come down here to Fort Lauderdale and let me take you to Criteria because they're you might be able to get a job there because I couldn't get a job anywhere. So I went down in 72 and met Ronnie and Howie Albert at Criteria, and this console of yours was sitting in the studio.
Yeah, and it was only a few years old at that point.
And I met them and saw this console, and I remember the Pantone faders. Is that what they are?
I don't know, what do we call them, like airplane faders or something?
Yeah. Anyway, I just remember looking at this thing thinking, wow, looks like a spaceship. And it was so compact, too, which was kind of cool because the Flickinger that I've been working on was huge. It was really a big...
Right, the mic pre's aren't even in the same room with you, I think,
well,
right?
they were above the patch bay. Then
Right.
little buttons you push to get, to attenuate the pad.
Yeah.
That's pad them down. Anyway, so I played some stuff, and they liked what I was doing and essentially said, yeah, we probably could find a spot for you here if you want to come down. But that's something in... the little voice said, man, let's hang around Nashville. Let's do that.
72, Fort Lauderdale. You did not want to participate in the new drug culture. That could have been part of it too. I don't want to pick on any different regions of the country, but I have to imagine that, the musicianship and the players here in Nashville was probably something that pulled you back too.
I don't often know why I have said no to certain things. I don't really know why. Something in my gut told me not to do that. And it turned out okay.
Yeah. Yeah, cool. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you as you were answering the question from talking about Arif and vocal production.
Right.
Advice.
Well, Arif, at one point I was in a meeting and Arif took me aside and said, he said, I'll give you some advice. And it was like, my ears like went weep. And he said, don't make records with people who can't sing.
I wanted to ask you that question all during this interview too.
Yeah. And so when somebody says something like that, especially with his stature, it was sort of like the emperor's new clothes. It was like, oh, that's so obvious, but such good advice. So from that moment on, I became very picky about who I would take on as an artist and who I wouldn't. And except for a couple of rare occasions when I've broken that rule, I have pretty much depended upon working with people who were really good singers, which makes producing a vocal a breeze.
Yeah.
And so my advice is find great singers and then just encourage them to do their best work.
I would almost suggest that it might be easier to start with a great singer and then find a great song to use than it is to start with a great song and make a not great singer work. Well, I guess that's not really the way to put it, but you know what I mean? Like if you have a great singer, can you always find a great song from somewhere?
No.
No. Okay. All right. Tell us about that.
Well, great songs are, they don't grow on trees. And you can, I've recorded songs that I thought were really good, but they weren't a good fit for that particular artist. Great songs they're a mystery all of their own, I think.
That's another version of the casting call, right? It's the song matching the singer just right.
Yep. And one of the beauties of working with a guy like Randy Travis is he was very clear about who and what he was. And so if a song didn't really fit that sense of himself, we didn't do it. And that helps too. I think there are artists, and I would call Randy an artist because he's very clear about what he's doing. And then there are entertainers. Mm-hmm. And an entertainer is going to be actually in some ways more difficult to find songs for because the landscape is larger. And it depends on...
They're capable of singing more songs.
They are. It's like people who win The Voice, to me, those are not artists. Those are really good singers. But they feel like they could end up being in Vegas. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That's valid. But, James Taylor's not going to win The Voice.
Right.
Bob Dylan's not going to win The Voice. Those are artists. And so I always try to find people who had a strong sense of who they were and what they wanted to stand on a stage and sing to that audience. It made my life a lot easier.
Well, that's great. That's great advice. Thank you for sharing all that. And why don't we take 5 and then we'll come in for the jam session.
Okay.
Rockstars, I'll remind you that you will find links to all the stuff we're talking about in the show notes. You had mentioned a YouTube link of your early recording, right?
Yes. There's a couple of songs up. One of them is called Monday is Fading Away by the Glass Threads.
Okay, great. Well, we'll find that one.
And the other one is called You'll Know the Pain. That was the A and the B side of our single back in 1967. And have a laugh.
Awesome. All right, Rockstars, we'll see you guys in a minute for the jam session. Hey Rockstars, I want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Mic Tech Audio, right here in Nashville, Tennessee. Mic Tech is a maker of awesome microphones and recording equipment. Whether you're looking for a simple plug-and-play USB mic or a high-end condenser tube mic, Mic Tech has you covered. Mic Tech is the only mic I've used for this podcast, Recording Studio Rockstars, and nearly 100 episodes. You're hearing my voice right now on the Mic Tech Procast SST. Thanks to you Rockstars for listening, and to Mic Tech Audio for the sound of over 350,000 downloads. Check them out at mictechaudio.com. Cheers. Hey Rockstars, it's Lid Shaw. Welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm about to hit the jam session with my guest Kyle Lehning today. Kyle, are you ready to jam?
Let's do it.
All right, cool, man. When you started out in recording, what was holding you back?
Well, I fell in love with the idea of being a recording engineer in '67, and studios, you had to go to where there was a studio. And even though I had tape machines and microphones, I was doing it myself. But to get into a really professional recording space required shoe leather.
Right.
Had to go to New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Nashville. That was kind of it.
You couldn't make a hit record with a local church organist in Cairo, Illinois at that time?
No, I couldn't. I couldn't. So it was a real investment in a dream, and so fortunately for me, it was easy to pick Nashville.
Yeah. Well, I felt the same way. I didn't even know that these were the three music hubs. Really, I was that clueless when I got into this. I came down here because of Middle Tennessee State University, went to school here, and then realized that Nashville was an awfully good place to be to make records. And I still think that despite the ability for people to make records from home studios and be anywhere and connect through the internet, there's still something wonderful about being in a place where there's so many great musicians and so much music happening. So not to discourage anybody, I want to encourage everybody, but definitely if you can find where your musicians are and find where the people are that are like-minded and taking it seriously, it's a great place to be.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so now how about some of the best advice? You've shared a lot of great advice already. Anything else pop to mind?
Oh gosh.
Best advice you received, maybe.
I don't really, off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of, it may pop up in conversation, but I think maybe the best advice was the advice my father gave me when he was a second generation pharmacist. And when it became apparent that I was not going to be a third generation pharmacist, I think I was maybe 14 years old, and I was playing in a rock and roll band, but I was either going to, at that point, my two loves were playing music and playing basketball. So I figured I'll either have something to do with music or I'll be a junior high school basketball coach.
Right, and you're still doing both.
Yep, I have. Yep. And I love both of those things. But my dad basically said, you don't have to be a pharmacist, but you do have to find something that you love. And he didn't just preach it. Anytime I was enthusiastic about something, he fanned the flame. It was almost absurd how much, flame fanning he would do. I was a pole vaulter in high school, a really average pole vaulter.
And he bought you your own pole?
He bought me a fiberglass pole. And we had it for the school. The school kept it, but it didn't help me a bit, but it helped a couple of other guys, because we were using aluminum poles back in those days. And then fiberglass poles had just started to become, and he said, maybe you'll enjoy it more if you can use this.
That's great.
And he bought instruments, and every Christmas there'd be something under the tree that I didn't even know what it was. It's like, I got my first melodicas from my father for Christmas. And I was like, what is this thing blowing in it? And, I have a bass melodica, for gosh sakes.
That's so funny. Yeah, as a parent, I can really appreciate that.
Yeah.
So that's good to know.
Yeah.
I like that. Makes me feel a lot better about encouraging my daughter for everything she gets interested in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Although I think as parents, we cheat slightly too, because we sort of encourage, we we encourage, but we guide them this way a little bit or that way,
Yeah,
I mean,
but
I'm sure your dad was, he was a musician. He was interested in music. He was probably pretty happy that you were interested in music.
Well, I think when I came home and told him I wanted to be a recording engineer, that would be like almost saying I wanted to be an astronaut. It's like kind of, now, what exactly does that mean? But he was fabulous.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, my dad had no idea what recording engineer was when
Yeah.
I said I wanted to do it either.
Yeah.
All right, so now how about a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something our rock stars could use today on their next session?
Oh, good gosh. There's so much going on in the world of recording these days.
What's one that you used recently?
Well, you know what? I tell you, here's a tip. I'm still poking around with just instructional videos. I mean, I've been doing this for 45 years, and I just went on to Mix with the Masters and watched one of my favorite engineers, Chad Blake, doing some stuff on there. And it was like, oh, man, I had never thought about that. Is cool. I like that idea. There's just so much to learn all the time. So, I don't know that I have any super tips.
What was the trick?
Well, it wasn't even a trick. It was just the way he was using the Eventide Omnipressor plugin. And I remember that box back in the day. Funny thing about plugins, there are some analog boxes where I get the plugin and go, nah, that's not happening. And there are some digital plugins when I get the plugin and go, the box never sounded as good as this does.
Interesting.
Yeah, like there's the UA Cooper Time Cube.
Oh, right, yeah.
I had access to Cooper Time Cubes. They sounded like
a garden hose?
Like a garden hose. They were awful. And you could only do certain things with them. And, people like going, yeah, this is cool. It's like, not for me, it's not cool.
Yeah.
I get the plug-in. It's like, this thing is very cool.
That's awesome.
There's all kinds of other little things that they've given you access to you couldn't possibly do. And it's like, that thing's one of my go-tos,
Well, I haven't listened to the Cooper Time Cube yet, but I love the idea. And I know it's one of those things you could build yourself too if you wanted to make the analog version.
Yeah.
But you've already explained that the analog version we may not want to make.
Well, it didn't thrill me.
Yeah. That's a cool tip, though. We'll check that out. Yeah. We'll put a link to that as well. Now, how about a favorite hardware tool, something physical that when you've got it on a session, you're glad you got it?
Well, for me, it's just having great microphones and there's the great Elvis joke. It's like Elvis told me never to name drop. So
right.
So George Massenberg's an old friend of mine I've known for a long time, and he makes these 8900 compressors, I think is what they are, and it's got so many knobs and so many weird names for things, like hysteresis and stuff like that. So George, what is that? Well, he never has really told me what that is, but it's a great sounding compressor. It's not cheap, and I use it all the time on stuff, and it's transparent, but it really does a nice thing. What it does is it makes softer things louder and louder things softer.
Yeah.
So it decreases the dynamic range in a very musical, sort of transparent way. So hardware, that's a piece of gear that travels with me.
All right, cool.
All the time.
And they're very colorful. He always makes his boxes have the nice red, yellow, green kind of stuff on the face, right?
Yeah. And, most of the time we're looking for something with character out of the outboard gear. And I wouldn't say that George's compressor has a lot of character. It just does a really cool thing.
Bring the character out of the instrument.
Yeah, exactly right.
Instead of out of the piece of outboard gear.
That's right. Exactly right.
All right. Now, how about a software tool? Anything you want to recommend that you've been enjoying?
Well, I told you the latest is this Eventide Omnipressor, which is just the vibiest, coolest. For me in the digital world, compression is the hardest thing to make really sort of act like it did in the analog world.
Right.
I don't know why, but for me it is. And so,
well, I think one of the reasons too is because in the analog world, the really cool stuff was pretty extreme too. I mean, you can take an LA2A and just about dime the needle.
Yeah.
And it can sound fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can't always do that with a digital one in the same way, or it sounds digital all of a sudden if you do it.
Yeah. I'm not smart enough to know why all that stuff is, it's just the way it seems to me.
Yeah.
But this Omnipressor really does a thing. It really feels like it's grabbing things. We were talking earlier before we started doing this interview. We were talking about the Keypex gain brain,
right?
The Allison gain brain, and this thing reminds me of that. It's got that kind of really stomped down thing, but still, really useful. I like it a lot. So
that's cool.
Yeah.
All right. Now, how about a resource for the business side? Do you have some online tool that you use, or any advice for people who want to do this for more than a hobby?
I'm sorry to say, I don't think I do, because the business is so different from the one I grew up in, and the one that running a record label. People ask me stuff all the time. I don't think my knowledge base is terribly relevant. My own personal thing is I will help people make records with whom I want to work, but when the record's done, so am I.
Right.
I don't know what to tell them.
You're not out trying to promote it and sell it.
No,
and all that.
it's just such a Wild West kind of situation.
Well, let me back up a little bit and recall some advice you gave earlier. You said for Marif, make sure you work with a great singer. Choose great singers to work with. Did you feel like that was a lesson you could have followed from the beginning of your career to now? Or do you feel like there was this time when you're maybe engineering and your job is just to make it sound as good as it can, that if somebody else chooses a not great singer, well, that's just fine because I'm engineering today, I'm doing that? Or do you feel like, it would have still been wise to select projects that somebody else selected a great singer?
Well, I don't know what it is that causes me to say yes to a project or no to a project. It's just it's like the timing and the day and stuff. But, the whole notion of great singers is very subjective.
Right.
And there are singers that technically I don't think are great, but are incredibly expressive. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a little bit, the advice is a little tricky. I think the thing that I'm always looking for is to be moved by a performance and at some point to be surprised by it.
Yeah.
And so, that can happen in a voice that would not be considered technically great.
Right.
But
it's a sort of a trust your gut thing too.
Yeah.
Again, I like that advice as well.
Yeah.
Now, how about a organizational tool? Anything that helps you keep your shit together?
I don't know. I'm a slave to my phone, and I do find it useful. But I still, when I'm in the studio working on projects, and right now I'm sort of inexplicably busy. I don't know why I'm busy, but
thanks for taking time out to do this.
Oh, well, it's okay. My pleasure. I find a great big piece of paper or a board with the tasks actually laid out. I see you have like a marking board back here.
Whiteboard in the back
like
of the studio.
Yeah. I think that kind of thing is an anxiety reducer. And I think that it's hard in the digital world. That doesn't really exist in a real good way.
Too easy to not see that list.
It is. Or just have it on a page that I'm not going to turn to. So I think it's wise to have what you have here, which is and it can be like, here are the songs that need to be mixed, or here are the overdubs that need to be done. In a long time ago, in the late 70s, when I produced the England Dan record, and we were really busy making other records, Dan Seals and I sort of hit a wall of where we're out of control trying to figure out how to do this. And we came up with a template of a grid, and I had these printed up, and they're like large pieces of paper. And there was on one side was a place to list the titles, and then above the other side were a series of potential overdubs that would be done: lead vocal, background vocal, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, all these different things. And so you could look at it and see, you could look at 5 songs on one piece of paper and see what needed to be done on all those things. So if I had an electric guitar player coming in that I needed to overdub on 3 songs, I could see right away what those were. And I still use those today when I'm making records. And I had these printed in probably 1978, and I had enough of them printed. I figured out if I made 5 albums a year, I had enough printed for 200 years.
So you still have them?
I still have them.
Do they have your logo on there and stuff like that?
No, they don't. They're just these generic looking things. I've had a couple friends of mine
Would
borrow
you,
them.
do you have an ability to scan one, and would you be willing to share it with our listeners?
Sure, I probably could.
I can make a little download for you rock stars where if
it's
you
very simple.
get in, you can download that.
Yeah.
That's cool. I like that idea a lot.
Yeah. So, I mean, anything that reduces anxiety like that, I think is the right thing to do.
And what did you call this thing?
I called them my Acme production sheets.
Acme production sheets. All right. That's a long title. Rockstars, I'll make a link at rsrockstars.com/APS for Acme production sheets. And then you'll be able to download that sheet from this podcast in the show notes.
Great.
Awesome. Last two questions and we're done.
Okay.
If you had to start all over again, good Lord, if you had to start this all over again and you needed a simple setup to record with, you wanted to find people to record, you had to make ends meet. You know, you do have kids and you've had to share advice. What would you suggest to somebody who's just starting out?
Well, you mean in terms of gear?
Yeah. Some. It doesn't have to be too specific, but how should somebody think about, like, I want to start recording? What do I need to start with?
Well, you know, I started with when I was 11 years old with a Waylon sock and a microphone, and my buddies and I would record each other passing gas into the microphone. Found that to be fabulous. Then we would change speeds on the tape machine, which made it really hilarious. Go speed it up, slow down. It was just great.
I hate to be the singer on that mic on the next session, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, and now that there's ridiculously good stuff for relatively affordable numbers. And I mean, you could go to the Apple store and be swinging on GarageBand and it's a very different kind of approach. I still think learning to play an instrument
great place to start
is a really good place to start. And, no matter what it is, but, keyboard, guitar, something that makes you use a part of your brain that's not going to get used by copying and pasting things together. But I think there's genius in that too.
Yeah. Now, what about, when you went to go look for musicians, you decided to go to Nashville, or you just, forget what you said. Was Nashville your first stop?
It was.
Yeah. So would
it was
you
my only
recommend?
Stop.
Yeah, it's your only stop. Well, you looked at Florida for a minute.
I did.
Would you recommend people, same thing, that they got to get up and get to where the music's happening? Do you remember initially being able to discover music in a certain way and meet musicians and sort of break into a new scene?
Well, it's a funny thing. Music's a powerful art form, and it seems to find its way no matter where you are. And I grew up in a little town in Southern Illinois, and there were good musicians who were enthusiastic about what they were doing around there. My guess is they're all over the place. And no matter where one finds himself, there's probably somebody in the neighborhood or somebody around that is interested in something similar or something like that. So I always, when I go and talk to people in small towns or something, I always tell them to look locally first, because I think you never know who you're going to run into. You might run into somebody who writes great lyrics and needs a collaborator, or somebody that, is a good musician but doesn't sing. And I mean, there's always these missing pieces that that we get to fill in. It's maybe my only religious aha is I think that God gives everybody everything they need except for something, and that whatever that thing is that they weren't given, that's why they're going to have to figure out how to be in relationship with someone else.
That's great. That's great advice.
So I mean, I think that those people are around, because that person's missing something too.
Don't be afraid to go to the music store. Don't be afraid to go to the record store.
Yeah.
Just hang out, run into people.
Exactly.
How about jobs? Was your first job always in music, or did you have to deliver some pizzas on a bicycle or something back then? I don't know. I think we started out this by saying I'm a lucky guy, and I didn't have to do a lot of other stuff. I've always been able to find a way to make music pay me something, and until recently. It seems like now it seems like I get to do a lot of the work I do for nothing, and fortunately I have made money, so I can afford to do that. I mean, my dad, in his greater wisdom, suggested one summer that I get a job
outside of playing in a band. And this is a quick little story. So I worked with an electrical contracting firm for a couple of weeks. It happened to be the firm that the bass player in my band, his father owned the firm. And so I went to work there. I got my paycheck after 2 weeks in 1966. And I honest to God, I think after 2 weeks of 8 hours a day for 5 days a week, I think I cleared something like $47. and I went to my dad's drugstore with my paycheck, and I had just played that weekend. And we'd played on Friday and Saturday night. And I went to the store with my paycheck and said, Dad, we talked for a minute. He said, yep. I said, so here's my paycheck for, 80 hours of work. And it turns out that I'm making like 50 cents an hour, so this is what I cleared. He said, yep. And I said, and I opened my wallet and I took out $60. And I said, this is what I made from working 3 hours on Friday night and 3 hours on Saturday night. I got $30 for the gig on Friday. And I said, this just doesn't add up. And my dad said, can't argue with you. You can quit.
That's great.
Stick with music.
That's great.
Yeah.
All right. So last question, you get to take the studio Wayback Machine, go back and
Okay.
find young Kyle, tap yourself on the shoulder, say, what are you doing here, older, wiser Kyle? And you say, I've come back to give you this one bit of advice. If you could give yourself advice at the beginning when you were young, what would you say was the single most important thing to being a rock star of the recording studio one day?
You mean something I would change?
Yeah, you
Or-
just go back and give yourself one bit of advice.
I don't know about advice, but something that's clear to me about the way the business works now that wasn't true then, is that I think I was a music major in college, pretty good keyboard player, but I was never compelled to be a songwriter. But I think today I would have been, if I'd started over again, I would have been way more involved in actually creating songs and writing songs, because it just seems that and both my kids, Jason and Jordan, my oldest and youngest sons, are both, they do what I see a lot of young people doing now, which is what I think you have to do, everything.
Right.
And there's a part of me that says, well, how can you be really good at anything if you have to be involved in everything? Well, they seem to be managing to be pretty damn good at everything. So I think the capacity to do good work has increased in people. And I find it, really interesting and encouraging. They're both really fine songwriters. They're both excellent engineers. They're both really fine mixers. They can arrange. They know how to produce. And I don't think it's unusual now. I think young people who are trying to find a way to have this love pay their way have to be that flexible to pull that off. I think I could have been. I just didn't have to be. I was able to focus on an aspect of the business and really make that be the thing that I was going to get really good at.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. I like that. And I think I often feel that way too. Like I really want to focus on more music writing now, even, feel like it's not too late. Go back and write some more songs.
It is not too late.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars. What a pleasure to hang out with you and hear all these great stories. Can you tell our listeners how they can find you on the internet and learn more about you? Got any suggestions?
I don't have a website. I have an email address. And if you've got a question you want to ask me, my email, I've had it since the 80s. I'm happy to tell you what it is. It's Lehning, my last name, which is Lehning, F, which was my father's first name, Fred, and K, which is Kyle, my middle name. So it's LenningFK@AOL.com. You can email me with a question. I'll be happy to answer it. I wouldn't suggest sending me any songs because there's very little I could do with them.
That's cool. Even your email address is old school.
Yeah, AOL. I call it the vinyl of the internet.
Right. The vinyl of the internet.
Yeah.
I like it. Well, again, thank you so much. Rockstars, we will include links to the stuff we're talking about in the show notes. And remember, again, we will have rsrockstars.com/APS for Acme production sheet. We'll make sure we get that copy of that cool sheet from Kyle, and I'll make it downloadable for you. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
We'll see you around the studio.
Let's do.
All right, let's go find out how this thunderstorm's doing outside.
Okay.
All right,
thanks.
cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, please leave a rating and review on iTunes to help reach more people. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to recordingstudiorockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. And if you want more free content, all you have to do is text RS Rockstars to 33444. Again, that's RS Rockstars to 33444, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, and podcast updates. And I'll let you know about any upcoming giveaway offers, all totally free. Thanks for listening. I'm Lynda Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.